In the previous video, we built the Charybdis, a wireless split keyboard with a thumb trackball. The reception of that video far exceeded my expectations, and in fact it is now the most watched video on my channel at over 100k views. Naturally, this called for yet another keyboard project and subsequent video. For the new project, we wanted to take a step back and try something just a bit different. No PCB modifications this time, no experimental trackball implementations, just pure keyboard from start to finish. Of course, this was again made possible by JLC PCB, who made their PCB and 3D printing services available to us. Massive thanks to them, as this time around there's even more of the keyboard that is 3D printed. By the way, if you're watching this and haven't subscribed to my channel yet, subscribing now would mean a lot to me and you'd be playing an active part in helping me grow the channel. In return, I promise to continue making unique and high quality content. So today we're taking a look at the TOTEM wireless keyboard. This is an open source 38 key split keyboard designed by GEIST over on GitHub. At first glance, the TOTEM is not too dissimilar to the other split keyboards I've featured on the channel before. However, there are a few key differences that set this one apart. For starters, the TOTEM uses low profile switches, which I'm trying now for the very first time. Then we have the 5-column layout intended to be used with home row mods, something I did try before but only briefly and not for long enough to get used to. And last but not least, we have the column splay. In this type of layout, the outermost columns on each side angle away from the rest, a change that is aimed at improving ergonomics by positioning the keys in a more natural way. But the thing that really attracted us to the TOTEM in the first place is the design itself. The attention to detail is something to really appreciate here, and every millimeter of thickness is reduced through clever design choices, like the socket cutouts in the backplate that allow the switches to sit as low as possible. Putting this side by side next to the Charybdis, it's clear that in many ways these two keyboards are polar opposites, even though they do share some distant common DNA. Let's go back for a second to that 5-column layout I mentioned before. Those of you with a keen eye have probably noticed that the TOTEM does have an orphan key on each side. I think this could have easily been a full column, or maybe just a 2-key column with just a marginal increase to the overall footprint. As you can see, we opted to make the PCB in purple this time around instead of the usual black, to change it up a bit and to showcase some of the other colors available over at the JLC PCB. For the cases, we opted to focus on resin prints this time around, one in grayish black resin and one in JLC PCB's Imagine black resin. We did print one case using the MJF process as a reference, for which we went with the unpainted natural gray color. We did get some warping on the resin printed cases, likely due to the thinness of the design, but nothing that would have made them unusable. The prints themselves are very smooth, but the finish is more prone to blemishes, while the MJF has a more consistent look and a coarser structure. As usual though, the unpainted MJF can have color inconsistencies, so I think a painted black MJF print would have been the better choice here. After I had a good long look at the bare PCB, it was time to send it over to Void for the usual soldering. In the past, we used nice nano controllers to make our wireless split keyboards. The TOTEM is instead designed to use Seed Shao controllers, which are not only about half the size of a nice nano, but also about half the price, opening up the possibility for a more budget-friendly build. Of course, we needed a battery, and for that we're using a super tiny 100 mAh battery that fits neatly inside the case. For the switches, we went with Kale pink switches. The TOTEM does have hot swap sockets, so changing out the switches at any time would be really easy. After I got the PCB back from Void, it was time to put it all together. Assembly is fairly simple, and I found that doing it upside down is the easiest. You can simply drop in the standoffs into the walled holes of the top case and then position the PCB on top facing down. Just be careful with the battery, making sure not to damage it when lowering in the PCB. Once the PCB is nicely positioned on the top case, the backplate can be secured. Pretty simple and pretty painless. Next up, it was time to start socketing in the switches. It takes quite a bit of force to socket these in, so be prepared to hear some crunching as you go about it. Luckily, nothing snapped during my assembly. Finally, I added some silicone feet to keep the TOTEM from sliding around on my desk mat. One thing that has always put me off low-profile switches is the lack of diversity when it comes to keycaps. There is no comparison to the abundance of designs, shapes and materials you can find for MX-style switches. The solution of that problem was to use 3D printed keycaps instead. Enter the DES profile keycaps. The distorted ellipsoidal saddle is a completely unique custom sculpted profile designed by GitHub user Pseudoku. There are designs for both MX style switches and Chocolo profile switches. We printed sets for both styles of switches and in the process updated the keycaps on my other split keyboards, which now look even better. I do love the way the pink switches resemble tiny pig snouts, but sadly I had to cover them up with the 3D printed keycaps. This too takes quite some force, but again I managed to add all of them with no issues. The resin printed keycaps do have some blemishes here and there, so for that reason I would recommend printing extras. With all of it done and ready to go, it was time to commit to it and start using the Totem as my daily keyboard. It's always difficult doing these videos, as I need to give myself time to get used to a different shape or a different layout, and I expected that getting used to the Totem would take quite a while. But to my surprise, it didn't really. A week in, I already had most of my typing speed back and felt relatively comfortable with the new layout. That's not to say that learning to use it was easy. In fact, for the first day or so, I was constantly triggering modifiers on the home row keys because I was typing too slow and I was dragging my key presses. But here's the part that surprised me the most. When I first moved to a split keyboard from my 60% keyboard, my touch typing skills improved quite a bit. And a similar thing happened after I started using the Totem with its 5-column split layout. Many of you commented on how I avoid using my pinky when typing, a habit that has been pretty hard for me to shake off. And yet, the moment I started using the Totem, it felt natural to type using all my fingers. Now, it's all about improving speed and muscle memory. I also wonder if this new habit will carry over going forward to other keyboards and to other layouts. Typing feel is another matter, however. While I like the shorter travel on the low-profile switches, the feel and sound is a far cry from my preferred Gateron Oil King switches that I use in my other keyboards. These feel and sound like what I imagine typing on a Lego keyboard would be like. Clacky, scratchy, and kind of charming, I guess. A smoother switch would be welcome, but I think the high-pitched clacky sound would still be there. I try not to look at this in terms of better or worse, and instead I approach this as its own unique thing. There is another aspect I find interesting about the Totem, the fact that in a way it's a return to basics. People coming from weighty 60% keyboards with gasket mounts and finely tuned sound signatures might scoff at the sound of the Totem, but I find that it has its own charm. It's not worse, it's just different. Okay, so typing on it is one thing, but have I tried playing any games on it? Right away, just by looking at the layout, it's clear that a WASD setup is just not going to work, not to mention all the unintended modifier key triggering you'd be running into. So to deal with this, I made a special game layer which I'll show you in just a moment, and instead of a standard WASD setup, I am using ESDF. And that feels pretty good to me in terms of ergonomics. It's still annoying to have to set it up for each new game, but there's no way around it on the Totem. Funnily enough, the toyish nature of the switches goes really well with Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, which I've been having a blast with on the Totem.
Picked up interdimensional messages and didn't get distracted trying to find friends. 0, none. Bros. I lost count.
Right, so let me show you how the layers are set up on my Totem. What you see here is essentially a combination of the Mirioku keyboard layout and GEIST standard key map for the Totem. I've added my own touches here and there, so let's go over it layer by layer. On the base layer, things are pretty straightforward. Of course, as we're essentially missing a column, all of our modifiers have to go somewhere. The home row mod keys take care of that. When tapped, these keys behave as they would normally, but when we hold them down, they will act as the corresponding modifier key. The home row mods are mirrored on each side, so there's kind of a dance you have to learn, like alternating shift modifiers when you need to capitalize certain words. To me, it was also important to be able to copy and paste things with just one hand, so I added a similar thing with the control key on the leftmost thumb cluster. There's other ways in which one could approach this using the ZMK firmware. Combo keys, for example, is a feature that allows an action to be triggered when two keys are tapped together. For example, you could have copy when tapping X and C, and paste when tapping C and V. Holding down the left side middle thumb key triggers my most used layer. On the left side of this layer we can find the directional keys overlaid on top of ESDF, while on the right side we have a numpad. In the middle we have a neat arrangement of braces, brackets and parentheses. Again from the base layer, but this time holding down the middle thumb key on the right side, we can trigger the symbol layer. This layer has all the symbols laid out in the same pattern as they would be if placed on the numerical row of a standard 60% keyboard. I guess muscle memory helps a lot here, so if it works, why change it? The third main layer that I use is triggered by holding down the extra key on the left half. There's really not much to look at on this layer, but tapping on the G key here will take us into my game layer. Most importantly, the game layer removes all the home row modifiers as well as the layer keys, and it brings back some useful modifiers to the thumb cluster, such as Alt and Control. Tapping the G key again will trigger a temporary sticky layer, which I call Game Plus. A sticky layer is a layer that is only active for a single key press. This is used for quick access to more keys, such as numbers, modifiers, or keys that would normally require moving the hand over to the other half. Exiting the game layer is simple enough, with a layer key that sends the keyboard back down to the base layer. Many of you have been asking about the cost of building one of these keyboards, so this time around I've put together a complete breakdown of all the parts and their respective prices. This price list represents the full bill of materials for one complete build, but keep in mind making just one build is impossible without ordering extra parts. For example, the minimum order for PCBs at JLC is 5. Likewise, for other items such as switches and keycaps, you won't be able to get the exact number you need, and nor should you, as it's a good idea to have spares just in case. The total price also doesn't include any shipping or import duties, so you will need to account for that as well. Basically, only use this as a very optimistic starting point or to gauge the total real cost of the parts involved in a complete build at the time of making this video. Interestingly, as we can see here, a big chunk of the total is taken up by the printed keycaps. You can find much cheaper ABS keycaps if you shop around, but chances are they won't look quite as good. There isn't much else to optimize here. Printing the resin case at JLC PCB is likely as cost effective as it gets, unless of course you are able to print it yourself. As we can see here, the raw price of a complete totem build comes out to around 105 USD. There is one more thing, however, that I haven't included in this breakdown, and that is the dongle. The dongle is basically an extra SID-SHA microcontroller that you can connect via USB to whatever device you intend to use the keyboard with, just like you would with a wireless mouse dongle. To give it a less hacky appearance, Void went the extra mile and designed a small 3D printed housing for it. A dongle setup is optional of course, but it will increase battery life considerably, as now both halves of the keyboard are for all intents and purposes peripherals. I have not done a proper endurance test yet, but we're talking a battery life measured in months instead of around 7 days without the dongle. The other main benefit is that you're no longer dependent on Bluetooth. Say you want to go into your computer's BIOS to tinker with something. You can now do so because as far as your computer is concerned, the keyboard is always plugged in. Anyway, it's time for me to try and wrap this one up. So what are my takeaways, and will I continue to use the totem after this video? The biggest thing for me is how much I ended up liking the splayed layout, and how much that has helped me develop my touch typing. I like the aesthetics of the totem, it's seriously cool and super easy to transport, but I don't love the sound and feel of the low profile switches. The resin cases and keycaps also look really sleek, despite their imperfections if you look too close. Also, due to their smooth matte finish, they tend to be fingerprint magnets. I'm actually curious to see how these hold up in time, especially when it comes to the keycaps. Going forward, I would like to carry over the display layout into whatever we end up doing next. Maybe for our next project, me and Void will design our own keyboard and make a video on that. What do you guys think? Is there room for another Ergo split keyboard out there? I think that's it for this one. Thank you as always for making it to the end of the video, and I'm super curious to read your thoughts or questions down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, bye bye!